Okay, welcome everyone to the fourth session of the Mind of Plants Symposium. My name is John Ryan, one of the co-organizers of the event today. In this session, we have 8 speakers on the topic of plant and human politics. And if you want to know more about the speakers' bios and background, you can just click their profile in the Arts Front platform, and you can read about them and also contact them. The speakers' names there are in alphabetical order by their first names. So we have 1 hour and 20 minutes for this session, leaving plenty of time for questions and comments at the end. If you have a question, please feel free to write it in the comments box in the on the right side of the Arts Front platform. And for our speakers, we're just giving kind of micro overviews of our plants and our responses to the theme of the mind of plants. So just 5 minutes, please, and I'll give you a visual cue when you've reached your 5 minutes. All right, so we have 8 speakers, and I'll just briefly run through them, and then we'll begin with our first. Our first is Damiano Benvegnu, speaking on the Black Austrian pine. Then we have Sally Birch on Red River gum, and more generally on the theme of the mind of plants. Sophie Chao on sago, Monica Gagliano on wheat, Chelinay Gates on sandalwood, Solvejg Nitzke on common oak, Patricia Vieira on olive, and finally Steve Whalan on coralline algae. Okay, so let's begin with Damiano. When you're ready, please feel free to get started. Thank you, Damiano.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for organizing this amazing conference. And I'm gonna share my screen. I hope that you can all hear me, and eventually you will see my screen as well. My contribution to the volume focuses on a forest in central Italy and on the trees that constitute the forest. Beginning in 1938, in homage to the then dictator Benito Mussolini, recruits studying at the nearby Academy of the Forestry Corps planted 20,000 black Austrian pines, or the scientific name is Pinus nigra arnoldi, on the slopes of Mount Giano, above the little town of Antrodoco, to spell out Dux, the fascist leader's title in Latin. The outcome, and I'm going to share it on the screen, the outcome was an arboreal inscription so grand in scale that it was, and it still is today, visible from Rome, some 100 kilometers away. Completed in 1939, the project drastically changed the landscape as well as the ecosystem of the area, as that species of fir tree was not endemic to the region. Yet this topiary forest was also an impressive work of environmental engineering that might be credited with stabilizing the mountainside, thus saving the little town of Antrodoco from landslides and floods. This controversial formation stood intact until August 2017, when a fire, an accident, burned down part of the forest, again altering the ecosystem and giving rise to a critical conversation about the meanings and values of manipulated human landscapes. A debate has in fact ensued about the future of this arboreal monument to Italian fascism, eliciting varied reaction from outsiders, some mortified that he has survived so long, advocating for its total erasure, while neo-fascist groups have begun plans to restore it. Others have instead argued that the forest ought to remain as both a reminder of Italy's brutal past, indeed the prime example of the fascist appropriation of landscapes to mark the regime's domination of both the country and its nature, and an inviolable element of Antrodoco's history and sense of place. And most notably, however, the fire has generated an opportunity for the local community to engage with the peculiar history of the regional environment, one exploited for its rich natural resources since antiquity, as well as with potential new narratives that would promote both economic progress and cultural development on ecological ground. My contribution to the volume charts the social environmental history of the so-called Dux forest and its trees, as well as the debate about its future. In analyzing the varied reaction to the 2017 fire, I investigate how the Dux forest should not be taken only as a spectacle, but rather as a repository of material stories, a concrete three-dimensional shared reality, characterized by a series of processes and connections that weave together political institutions, human communities, and the non-human environment. Through my study of the forest in an environmental, socio-political, and historical context, I aim to present a semiotic nexus of community, justice, and ecology to serve as a model for reflecting on the relationship between ecopolitics, landscape planning, and the epistemology of our current socio-environmental crisis. In fact, my Dux forest research engages with what anthropologist Andrew Matthews has called the multi-species ethnography of the landscape. That is, an epistemic practice capable of paying attention to the temporal rhythms of processes as different as rapidly moving fires and slow-growing trees, soil formation, daily cycles of weather, and the structure of violence of political, economic transformation and state formation. Furthermore, I attempt to approach the forested landscape not as a static object, but as a performative place that comes into being through the co-presence of different actants, both humans and non-humans, through their embodied encounters and interactions. In this sense, my goal is to demonstrate that the specific landscape of the Dux forest and the forest itself can be properly understood only if we challenge any static disjunction and instead embrace an ecosemiotic approach according to which the neutral position of the observer is only a special condition. Ultimately, my research suggests that if we keep looking at the Dux forest only from far away, from the same fascist perspective that created the forest in the first place, the trees on Mount Jano would indeed exist exclusively as a fascist forest, a mere anachronistic spectacle of a violent regime. Instead, we need to go deep into the forest and allow the black pines to express the full extent of their ecosemiotic relationships and thus their collective cultural life as a dialectical assemblage, which encapsulates as well as reflects the mutual formative and at times indeed the contradictory bond between cultural identities, social historical awareness, and ecological knowledges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Damiano, for speaking on the conjunction of politics, plants, and environmental crisis. And I think you've set the tone very well for this session on human and plant politics and with the forest as a performative space, so much to think about. So thank you, Damiano. Our next speaker is Sally Birch on, Sally wrote about the Red River Birch. Red River Red theme of the Mind of Plants. So thank you, Sally.
Thanks so much, John. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Arakwal country and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you so much to Monica, John, Patricia, Leah, and the whole Arts Front team, and to all the presenters today. This has been such a beautiful collection of offerings, and it's a real honour to be part of this project. So to address the theme of this session, the ways in which plants determine human socio-economic and political life, and the responsibility of the possibility of joint plant-human politics, I'd like to start by telling you a story. So I'm just checking that you can hear me. Yep, I think so. So once upon a time, there was a woman in the middle years of her life. She had worked for many years in a job that didn't satisfy her deeper creative yearning, but she stayed in this job because she felt safe, in large part due to the sense of financial security that the job gave. One day, she met a woman who had learnt to listen to plants. With the help of the plants, she had remembered who she was and why she was here. Now she passionately wanted to help other humans to listen to plants so that they could remember this too. The woman who was unhappy in her job told the plant woman about how she stayed at the job because it gave her a feeling of security. The plant woman shared something the plants had taught her, and that was how security is really an illusion, that for any number of reasons it could fall away at any moment. She asked the woman what she needed to be able to leave her job, if that's what she wanted to do. Then she took the woman's hands and looked into her eyes and said, "Because the thing is, we need you to be everything that you came here to be." This struck a deep chord in the woman. She thought about what she needed, and she suddenly realized that she already had it, that thanks to the unconditional support of her loving partner and all of her loved ones, it was actually possible for her to leave the job she didn't love. She realized that the whole world was always conspiring for her to be everything that she came here to be. She gave notice at her job the following week, and she continued on her journey of remembering who she was and why she was here. She remembered how much she loved to write, and with a feeling of urgency, she began to write about the relationships between plants and humans. Well, as you may have guessed, the woman who left her job was me. So to address the question of this session of how plants determine human socio-economic and political life, in choosing to leave my job, my socio-economic reality changed completely. And this change was determined and supported by a conscious relationship between plants and humans. As for the political aspect, from a personal perspective, so political meaning relationships, I've come to accept that the quality of my life is determined by the quality of my relationships. My relationships with plants inspire me to listen deeply. Plants teach me that all relationships require deep listening. They remind me of this, and this ability of plants to remind the human mind is, to me, joint plant-human politics in action. This partnership with the mind of plants, this open-leafed offering that is available to all of us, all of the time, bypasses the stories of my human mind and delivers the core issue of whatever it is that I need to see in each moment. This leads me to the experience of realizing that I'm actually part of one big generous mind, a shared mind. When I tune into this shared mind, this joint plant-human partnership, I flourish. To support this ongoing flourishing process, having some kind of scaffolding really helps me. For me, this exists in two specific ways. On a solo level, it's in the form of daily meditation. On a group level, monthly ceremony. Both of these things have become a strong and nurturing backbone to my existence. The question that I often ask the plants is, please show me, what do I need to see? In response to this, clear guidance comes without fail. But one day, the response to this question was quite surprising. It was, don't ask what do I need, ask what do you need? So in the context of joint plant-human politics and what that might look like on a larger scale, can you imagine if our leaders were to regularly ask their community, what do you need? And what if by community, they were including the plants? To ask this question then would be to recognize the innate sovereignty of each member of the community, plant and human. The thing about sovereignty is that it exists with whether it's recognized or not, but sovereignty does not mean separateness. Recognizing sovereignty means recognizing the distinct essence of each being, whilst also recognizing the connections between all beings. So this question, what do you need, could be one gateway towards joint human politics. But the thing is, we don't actually have to wait for any external leaders to ask this question. We can ask this question anytime. We can ask it of our fellow humans and our fellow plants, and then our task is to listen deeply for the response. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sally. So listening to plants, being called by plants, and being called by plant people, the lessons we receive from plants, ideas of partnership, relationship, sovereignty, and an extended sense of community. So important to be reminded of those. So thank you for doing that. Our next speaker is Sophie Chao, who will speak on sago. So please begin when you're ready, Sophie. Thanks.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territories of the Darug people, to whose elders I want to pay my respects. So my contribution to the Mind of Plants Collective explores the intimate and ancestral relationships between native sago palms and indigenous Marind communities in the Indonesian-controlled region of West Papua. The sago palm is a pinnate-leaved palm of the humid tropics and freshwater swamps from which indigenous Marind derive their staple starch, sago flour. But as I discovered over the 18 months that I spent living in West Papua, the sago palm is far more than just a source of food. Marind consider this plant to be a sentient, agentive being with whom they share common descent from ancestral spirits. In particular, the forms of growth, development, nourishment, and fertility of the sago palm is correlated with that of Marind's own offspring. Young babies, for instance, often share a name with sago palms that flourished at the same time as their birth, whilst young girls who become pregnant share the names of sago palms whose trunk began to swell with pith before they begin to flower. But just as importantly, the sago palm is cherished and revered by Marind because of its capacity to coexist with a multitude of other than human companion species. And for this reason, Marind described the sago palm as a tree of many lives. These many lives encompass a whole range of organisms that thrive in and from the palm and its environment. Wild pigs, for instance, are attracted by the pith of palms and the cool waters of the sago swamp. Agile tree kangaroos and sugar gliders leap across the canopy, while solitary spotted possums nest between its tightly bunched sago fronds. Various avian species, too, are drawn to the sago grove, where they drink and feed, and to the safety of the sago tree crown, where they roost, and mate. They include inquisitive red-billed bush turkeys, emeraldine buff-faced pygmy parrots, and sharp-eyed grey goshawks. Sago's companion plants, too, are equally plentiful. They include wild sugarcane, swamp oak, and pandanus. In the humid undergrowth of the grove, termites nest on the palm in the wet season, while sago palm weevil grubs incubate in its stumps and pith. The humid air in the grove is alive, Marind described, with the buzz of pollinating insects, including bees and various wasp species. And even after it dies, sago continues to feed forest organisms, nourish the soil, and sustain diverse microbial, bacterial, and fungal communities with its rotting pith. The plant thus perpetuates its own vegetal afterlife in the many lives sustained by its generative decay. Over the last decade, however, thousands upon thousands of sago groves in West Papua have been razed to make way for industrial monocrop oil palm plantations. This radical destruction of sago lives and lifeways is a source of immense grief, anger, and mourning among Marind communities. Each organism's death provoked by the arrival of monocrops marks the end of a living, fleshly temporality distributed across species lines. Each sago death obliterates the stories, places, and organisms inscribed in sago's bodily matter, and each death forestalls the possibility of a meaningful present and the possibility of shared futures for the forest's dwindling communities of life. Human vegetal politics in West Papua then involve both lively and lethal plant companions. On the one hand, the native and cherished sago palm, and on the other, the introduced and invasive oil palm. Becoming with sago palm in West Papua is further significant in the light that Marind see their own identity, rootedness, and belonging as intrinsically tied with the fate of this plant. Indeed, Marind described himself as sago people, in contradistinction to Indonesian settlers, who they describe as oil palm people or rice people, in reference to their staple food. But Marind do not resign themselves to this reality of loss and ruin. They are active participants in ongoing movements of resistance, land rights advocacy, sago sucker transplanting, a literal form of grassroots activism, which they undertake, as they say, in the name of people and of sago, because both together formed shared communities of fate and struggle in the face of industrial monocrop expansion. In this place, justice too is conceived in multi-species terms, not just for humans, but also for sago palms, and even for oil palm, who many of my companions resent for its destructive effects, but whom they also pity because it too is subjected to human, institutional, and technological forms of exploitation, violence, and extraction. In this place, then, politics and justice will always be a multi-species story because plants and people come into being through their relationships to one another, relations at times lethal and destructive, and at others reciprocal and nourishing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sophie, for reminding us of these knotted issues of sentience and agency and in multi-species communities, and the importance of also thinking in terms of conservation and plant justice. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Monica Gagliano, who I believe will be speaking on wheat. So please start when you're ready, Monica.
Thank you, John. I better time myself. I've been imposing that on everyone else. So. Well, I would like to first acknowledge that I'm sitting on Arakwal country and in the northern rivers of New South Wales, and I give my respect to all of its inhabitants, people, like human people, as well as plants, animals, and all others, seen and unseen, including, of course, all of those elders, seen and unseen. My chapter was on wheat, primarily because I kept choosing plants that have been with me for a long time, and I had a very close relationship with, or I would say a love affair with some of them. And then as I was inviting, and we as a group were inviting people to contribute, my chosen plant would be taken. So it's like, oh no, I'll write about cacao. Oh no, I'll write about this. And I was like, okay. And then in the end, I realized that actually there was one plant that I didn't realize how long it had been in my life. And maybe before all of the other plants that I picked, and actually certainly. And these actually forced me to look at my roots. And so I would also like to acknowledge, and this is the first time I ever do this, I would like to acknowledge the fact that I was born in the northern part of Italy. And so I would like to acknowledge those people, seen and unseen, the mountains, the land, the ground, the plants, and the animals, and all others. Because it was in that place that for 18 years, I learned how to relate to wheat. And of course, being Italian born, wheat is pretty much a staple, and everything is about wheat, from the bread to the pasta to everything. And it's almost rude if you don't eat bread, and it's almost rude if you don't eat pasta. So my experience with wheat started very early. And of course, it wasn't a relationship that I chose. It was a relationship that was given to me as part of my cultural background. But now, fast forwarding many years later, I was challenged by someone, a very wise person, and he said to me, well, you're a scientist, then why don't you do this experiment and try to remove wheat from your diet and see what happens? And the first thing that happened to me actually was panic. I was like, what do you mean wheat? Can I not remove anything else? And he was like, try, this is an experiment for you. You're a scientist. So I did, and in the chapter of the book, I actually explore more deeply what happened in terms of the actual adventure that I went through. But fundamentally, what I've learned through my own personal experience, the embodiment of that experience was how wheat was actually controlling a lot of my mind, how I was thinking, how I was relating to my food, how I was relating to even the geopolitical situation, because I was blind to some of the things that are connected to these plants. And so when I removed the plant from my diet, not because I was allergic, actually quite the contrary, it was very interesting to see how this simple act of taking away from the diet a plant that actually can be pretty toxic to some people, I could actually make a small revolution. I remember when I was little, my grandma used to buy what we call farina integrale, which is basically wholemeal wheat. And in my family, people would laugh at her because they were like, but why are you eating that stuff? it almost was the poor people bread. But actually, probably that was the closest to the original wheat that is not as processed as we have it now. And this idea that something was lost in the process of modernizing, and there was a real cultural politics of like that we are no longer poor, we don't eat that kind of plant, we eat these other plants. It was very interesting, of course, in hindsight, because I didn't realize at the time. And what happened to me was that I had to reevaluate everything. But I just realized that this was a very simple act of rebellion. So if we want to change the world, we can do it in very simple, small act, and we can start from our dinner plate. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Monica, for reminding us about those ubiquitous but powerful plants like wheat, tobacco, rice, soy, all of those that surround us almost on a constant basis. So great, thank you. Our next speaker is Chelinay Gates, who wrote about sandalwood for the book. So welcome, Chelinay.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to talk about sandalwood today. I was actually interested in unity governance. So I'd like to welcome everyone, and I'm speaking from Wajak Noongar country in Western Australia, in Guildford, and my bloodline is Kurrajari from the northwest, Kimberleys. I believe that this symposium is allowing us the opportunity to imagine collectively a world where all created things are invited to the table of justice and compassion, where the right to be is held up as precious, and that the harmony for all, be they human, plant, microbe, stone, air, water, and the elements, will be of the foremost consideration. In order to share governance with plants, we are to explore our differences. As an Indigenous gardener, I acknowledge and respect the individual spirit of each plant and the country on which it grows, and the ancestral spirits who've tended them. I understand that plants are sacrificial in nature, expecting to and delighting in the sharing of themselves in every part of their life and death cycle. As human, I recognise our greatest weakness is I-centeredness, which demands dominance over our environment, be it on this planet or another, and requires dominance over other species in order to broadcast success, fame, and fortune. Here, right now, in these many places in Zoomland, we have become one. Let us walk to the beat of a different drum, not the drums of war. Let's put aside that old desire to possess, control, and oppress. Let us walk to the beat of the human heart, the clapping sticks, and the beating of leaves in the wind. In this new heart space, let us talk the language of unity governance, by inhaling guidance from everywhere and everything. We will find new words to describe what unified being is and express its new wisdoms. Their traditional values and understanding will meld and deepen with our present explorations. And we will embrace not just the local, the country, the planetary, but we will set a charter for universal, spiritual, equitable abundance and custodianship. Plants must have innate rights to hold territory. In Western Australia, we've just dug out an 850-year-old boab and transported it far from its home and planted it in a park. This is not acceptable, and in the future, we may not be talking about plants, we might be parks, we might be talking about Mars. We also cannot commodify rare spaces, its plants and species, and by giving such places value, we set a price for the rich to buy and exploit it. We must find new ways to modify our wants so that Mother Nature can help us recognise our needs, those needs of love, health, happiness, longevity, wisdom, and spiritual awareness. Blessed are the weak, for you shall inherit the earth. Thank you. Hello.
Thank you, Chelinay, for a beautiful, inspiring
Thank you.
presentation. And this idea of plant-based governance, what might it look like? Maybe we can think about that during the Q&A session.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Solvejg Nitzke, who wrote on the common oak and who may speak on that plant or the subject broadly. So Solvejg, when you're ready, please.
Hi, good morning from Germany. Good afternoon to all of you in Australia. I was tempted to say Austria because that's what I'm doing my research on. So like Monica, I was hoping for the common oak not to be taken because that tree really captured my attention for a while now. I'm working on a project that's called Making Kin with Trees, exploring the different ways in which we forge relationships and if it might be possible to find relationships or really discover and ask maybe the trees for the relationship in ways that are not violent. And the oak is so interesting because as a literary scholar, of course, I turn to books and stories first when I want to know something about a plant, or that's usually where I encounter them before I find them outside. And I know that for many people, that's the wrong way around. But when looking for the ways in which humans try to connect with non-human others, I think the ways in which we try to kind of decenter our attention and the agency that we ascribe to ourselves as humans, literary forms of writing and fictional storytelling forms might actually be better tools or let's say ways of making kin than many other of the ways we've tried so far, or at least they could well add to it. So the common oak is, as you probably know, one of the most widespread trees in Europe. Maybe not in a botanical sense, but certainly in a storytelling sense. For me, as a scholar of German literature, they're ubiquitous. Every Grimm's fairy tale is full of oaks, even though beeches and all kinds of other trees should be in there too. But what's so interesting about the oak is the different layers of history and storytelling that come into them. They're known for their endurance, their strength, and the nourishment they provide. So there have been many books centered on the oak and its history in all kinds of European centered ways. And but the one oak I wrote about for the Minds of Plants and that I encounter almost every day in Dresden is the splintered oak or Splittereiche. And she actually made me think about the capacity of the oak not only to provide nourishment, but to hold and disturb the ways in which we memorialize human history. This oak is called a splintered oak because it still holds shrapnel from the bombs that hit Dresden in February 1945. And what makes it so special, and I added photos of the oak to the map, is that it fronts a gaping wound in its trunk, and it's really big. It's almost 2 meters high, and you could stand in the oak, of course, if that were permitted, because now it is covered in order to protect the oak. So what the oak does, or what I want to explore further in my book as well, what the oak might be doing is actually disturbing the ways in which the Second World War and the cost on human and non-human life it took in Dresden especially is remembered. As you can imagine, Dresden is full of memorials, reconstructed, deconstructed, and newly erect that have, as you might call it, problematic histories. And the way I came across the oak was long before I moved to Dresden, in a novel by Marcel Bayer called Kaltenburg, which is actually about an ornithologist. But it starts in Dresden with a narrator telling the story of how he and his parents lived through the air raid of February 1945 and sheltered under the oak. The oak for the narrator and for many people in Dresden is a living remnant, a witness that disturbs the story of rebuilding or being able to reconstruct a before the war. It keeps the memory alive, literally, and resists attempts to be memorialized. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Solvejg, for introducing the idea of how plants help us to make sense of history. A really important one. Viewing the presentations, if you'd like to pose a question, just write your question in the chat window, and then we will ask those questions to our presenters after. Okay, our next presenter is Patricia Vieira, who's a co-editor with me and Monica of The Mind of Plants. And so, Patricia, when you're ready, please speak on the olive tree. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, or good afternoon, I guess, if you're in Australia. I'm speaking to you from Lisbon, Portugal. It's really a pleasure to be part of this symposium. It was a great pleasure to organize it. I hope everyone's having as much fun as I am. I am going to share my screen and show you a PowerPoint. Here it is. I hope everyone can see it. And so the plant I wrote about for our book, The Mind of Plants, was the olive tree. And my idea was to choose a plant that was part of my routine, that somehow shaped my daily life. And my first thought was actually to choose the tea bush because, sorry, I cannot. Because I drink green tea almost every day. And so the plant, the tea plant, has been a companion to all of my research projects for the past 10 years or so. When I'm tired or sleepy, I just drink a strong green tea. And on those days when I'm really stuck at a particularly difficult part of a chapter or a book, and I do not feel like writing at all, green tea is always something to look forward to. I just climb the stairs to my office and sit down in front of the computer and drink my green tea and I write. And this makes me wonder how much of what I have written over the past few years was molded by the tea plant. How much of this plant's mind has come to be part of my own mind, and what my thought processes would be without green tea. How can a plant hailing from so far away, from China, and I usually drink Chinese tea in my American and Portuguese homes, how can this plant that comes from so far away determine my existence? And this made me reflect about the impact of globalization upon even the smallest details of our lives, upon something as simple as boiling water and making tea. But the tea plant, alas, was already taken for the book. It was taken by our colleague Janice Lee, who wrote a beautiful chapter on the tea. So I decided to write on another plant that has also been accompanying me for a very long period of time. And this plant is the olive tree. And olive oil has been part of my diet for as long as I can remember. I eat it as an appetizer, in salads, in stews, with baked foods, and I eat it pretty much every day. And I have also always liked olive trees. They are not too tall, they are not too menacing, and their leaves are perennial, so you can see a touch of green in the winter. And I like olive trees so much that I actually planted an olive tree to celebrate my son's first birthday, and you can see it here in the PowerPoint. This olive tree, there's another photograph of it, came to join an oleaster, or a wild olive tree, that was already living in my garden when I bought the house. So my son is now turning 5, and you can see how tall the olive tree now is. It was really quite small when I planted it. So here you can see the greener, light green olive tree and the dark green oleaster in the background. So to write my chapter for The Mind of Plants, I embarked on this mission to find out more about olive trees and about their history in my native country, which is Portugal, in order to try to understand why this plant was so important in my own life. And I discovered that the oleaster, so the wild olive tree, has grown throughout the Mediterranean basin for a really long time, for millennia. And it was domesticated to become our current olive tree that produces olive oil at around 6,000 years ago, making olive trees some of the oldest domesticated trees in the world. The first domesticated olive trees were brought to Portugal by Phoenician merchants, probably some 4,000 years ago. But it was the Romans and the Roman Empire that brought very sophisticated olive oil pressing techniques to the Iberian Peninsula. And the Portuguese are now the fourth biggest per capita olive oil consumers in the world. And each person consumes an average of 7 kilos of olive oil per year, only behind the Italians, the Spaniards, and the Greeks, who are really the champions of olive oil consumption, as you can see here in the chart. So my connection with the olive tree and with olive oil is actually part of a really long history that goes back for centuries. And the habit of olive oil eating cuts across not only my personal history, but also the history of the Southern Mediterranean and of Portugal. Olive trees have made themselves at home in Portugal and have shaped the country's landscape for many centuries. My paternal grandmother and both maternal grandparents were farmers, and their families tended olive groves. But perhaps as I was writing this paper and researching for it, I came to understand that it was the olive trees who looked after the farmers and gave them nourishment and a steady source of income. And I was left to wonder, after my journey of discovery to write the chapter for the mind of plants, to what extent the olive oil I eat every day became part of me. I was left to wonder how much of my cultural and physical makeup and how much of my thinking even is linked to this tree and entwined with its existence, and also to what extent my daily interaction with this plant and through this daily interaction, its mind has come to become entangled with my own. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Patricia. And I also like that you spoke about the plant that you didn't end up writing about. So that's some new information for me as well. So our last speaker in the session is Steve Whalan, who wrote on the coralline algae for the mind of plants. So thank you, Steve.
Thanks, John. Welcome. Hello, everybody. So today I'm going to talk about coralline algae. Coralline algae are really a group of algae. I'm an animal ecologist, so what I'd like to really dig into is talk about connections between animals and this group of coralline algae. Now, it's not lost on me that there's this great debate amongst the taxonomic experts about whether algae are actually plants. And I'm not going to, I talk a little bit about that in the essay, but I'm not going to dwell on that, but I think it's pretty clear which side of the fence I sit on. So I've always thought of them as plants. So that's how I'm going to talk about them and how I've written about them. But so what are these coralline algae? They're subtidal plants, algae, that are found pretty much in every aquatic habitat, freshwater included, mainly marine. They're an odd plant algae, if you like, to me. They're very almost inconspicuous. So you'll have forms that are encrusting, they form carpet-like mats over rocks and things like that. They are very shades of red, pink, orange, purple, brown. And you also have some forms that are erect and branching, but they don't grow very, very tall, so centimetre type scales. So they're in many ways aren't a real notable sort of presence on reef situations. But I think for me is what really sort of puts them under a spotlight is the the role they play, the ecological role they play in ecosystems. So this is a story about ecology, really, and the importance that of those roles in keeping those reefal communities together. So here's an example. In a coral reef situation, you have corals, obviously, and as adults, corals make up these reefs. They're fixed to the bottom of the reef. As adults, that's it, that's their chosen life. But when they produce these larvae that are spawned and mobile, so they end up drifting away in the current, and they actually make a choice of where to live. So as they're drifting out there in the ocean, many of them die, sadly, but the ones that make it back to any sort of reef or habitat are then faced with a decision. So they have to decide whether this is going to be the place where they're going to settle, metamorphose, and turn into a baby coral, for example. And what makes that job easier is actually the coralline algae. So I imagine them like this beacon, this navigational beacon flashing to these larvae. And so the larvae and the algae meet up, and there's this communication. So there's a sense of communication between these quite disparate groups, animals and algae. And the weird thing really is that they don't really have any sensory capacity, so it's all done on a cellular level. Anyway, so quite often after this interaction, the coral must sense like this is great habitat, and it settles and grows into coral. So therein lies this great sense of communication between these groups. Now, of course, these coralline algae aren't totally altruistic and saying, like, this is the be-all and end-all for coral. If the coral larva, for example, decides it wants to get very cozy and actually settle on the algae itself, it often will shed cells, so it's just tough luck for that algae. But what happens is if the coral senses that this is a great environment, talks to this algae and settles away from it, this is what builds this diversity in these reefal systems. So that's, I guess, what I talk about, and really fascinates me as an animal ecologist, at least, this sense of communication between these very disparate groups. Now, I don't know whether I can really fit that into a plant human political type of situation, but I do like to think of it and reflect on it as this. So in this system, this ecosystem where you have algae and plants and animals existing together, it's kind of nice to think of it as a political system. You have all the elements there. You have group decision making, so you have this communication between the alga and the coral larva, for that example. You have some sort of power play. You have the algae and coral competing and dealing. The alga deals with that by shedding its cells, for example, if the coral larva settles on the actual plant itself. But overall, you have this sense of resource sharing, and that is what gives these reefal communities, especially coral reefs, this great level of diversity and all these things living together. So for humans, quite often we separate ourselves from nature. We have this disconnect from nature. And so it's kind of sobering to look at this example, I guess, and think about that, how we might construct our own local and global communities. We certainly complicate our systems with geopolitical boundaries or cultural or religious differences. And I guess at the end of the day, it's nice just to look at these systems in nature, such as the story of these coralline algae and how they interact with corals, for example, and take a leaf out of that book. So that's all I have to talk about, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. And we're so pleased to have coralline algae in the book because it's the only marine plant in the anthology. And I think you've reminded us of the coral reef as a political system involving decision-making and power dynamics and resource sharing. And that's a good point to transition into the Q&A session. For me, this session has reinforced the idea that politics is not only the operations of nation states, governments, and communities, but can be understood more generally as relationships, interactions, and dynamics. So we can think of politics between people and plants, but also the politics between plants and animals and between plants and other plants. So it's a kind of blowing open of the concept of politics that's very useful, especially thinking in terms of conservation. Thank you so much for some wonderful presentations, all of which wove into this theme of the politics of plants and humans in their own way. And that's the wonderful diversity of the presentations that we had. So Monica is going to assist me with the Q&A because I cannot actually read the questions that clearly on the mobile phone. So Monica, is there a question for any particular presenter or generally for all of our speakers?
Yep, so there are a couple quite long questions, quite juicy. So I'm just gonna read them as they came, and I think they are really directed to the panel in general. So one question that seemed to connect several contributions are the themes of economy and trade through consumption and capitalism. I do wonder whether and when these forms of circulation are violent relationships or ecological kinship to the individual panelist.
Great question. Anyone care to get going? To what extent does violence and kinship factor into the plant politics that as you understand it?
Can I say that I think it's both? And that as humans, we are complex, and our love is always tinged with that conflict often, you know, all arts, dramas and everything have conflict. So it's not unusual to see that there may be some cases where it's a violent collection, or it may be a blessing. And I think that this will change in the future. We're in the process of change, and that's what we have to look to, rather than being totally absorbed. We must get justice, but we must also see a way of peace to go forward internally for ourselves.
Thank you, Chelinay. Any other responses? Yes.
When you look at trees, I think it's very important, like Chelinay said, to factor in both, because I don't think there is kinship without any kind of violence. If you think of human-to-human relationships, if you really expect, or if you only call kinship or relationship that goes on without any kind of emotional violence or anything, then you won't have any relationships. So I think the important thing, especially with the trees, and that fascinates me so, but the splintered oak, is to find ways to heal and to not cover up, but to heal and go on with relationships. So if we wait until we strip out all of our trade relationships and all of our relationship to plants from violence, then we won't have any. And I mean, eating was thematized. How do you factor in eating? How can you have a relationship to a plant, take it in literally without expecting to commit violence, to cut it down, to do all those kinds of things? So I think the important thing is to tell stories that can have living relationships, that factor in that there is no way of not being violent while needing to consume and to be and to compete about place and stuff like that.
Thank you, Solvejg. Yeah. Any other comments?
Yeah, I wanted to add that the questions also lead us to think about colonialism more broadly. I mean, many of the plants that we eat today, and Solvejg talked about the issue of eating their plants that are not native to the regions where they now grow. And there's a lot of discussion about plantation culture in the Americas, for instance, but Sophie also mentioned these kinds of issues in other areas of the world. I wonder, I mean, there is no point now where we could go back and remove, let's say, potatoes from Europe or rice from the place where it was not originally from. So we cannot expect to go back to a certain purity where we only cultivate and have plants grow where they're originally from. So this is, at this point in the history of our world, I think pretty much impossible. I think what we have to think about now is the ways in which we deal with these plants that are now already outside of their original places of growth, so to speak, and to prevent the mistakes of colonialism and this sort of widespread plantation style plant growing to become just the only way in which we relate to plants. And so it's not because a plant was brought to a certain area by colonialism that it's necessarily bad. It's just the way in which we relate to this plant today that needs to be considered. And this can't involve just removing that plant from there, but thinking about what kind of relationship we want to establish with that plant.
Can I just say, I believe that plants, any plant you need is within arm's reach. And if you have that as a philosophy, then you know that at some stage, if plants are brought artificially to you, it's not by coincidence, that they're destined to be with you and they're for your health and your healing. And if we're looking at violence, the process of birth is a violent one, but yet it bears beautiful fruit. And if we look at this plane as being the plane of suffering, and from that we evolve, including plant consciousness will evolve as well, not just us.
I really like what Solvejg and Steve actually shared in the context. I mean, it threads to all of the comments that have been made and all the sharings, but well, on one side, Steve, you spoke about how, you know, a coral is, there is a beautiful relationship between the arrival of a larval coral and then the coralline alga sitting there and kind of calling it in and creating the perfect environment for this coral to become eventually a coral reef, right? So to actually provide a space and building the structure for higher biodiversity, which is what life wants to do, to create more forms. So, but at the same time, so you have this beautiful, what we define as like, oh, isn't it sweet? The coralline algae is helping the little larval coral to settle and find a home, right? And then at the same time, though, you're sharing, but sometimes, you know, the coral actually decide, yeah, this is a good spot. And the algae needs to come out, somehow give space, and that it's death. So I think that the core issue here, which is possibly the core issue of a lot of misunderstanding in our way, at least in our modern society that is driven by consumption and capitalism, is not so much the actual act of dying, because death is actually part of life. And we are totally, absolutely, death is a taboo, and we are totally, absolutely scared of it. And until we actually face the fact that death is part of life, or it is life, you know, you need to die at some point to make space for someone else too. And so just like the coralline alga is dying to give space to a coral reefs, I think that it's actually the way in which we value things and how we give value and meaning to the things around us. So then it connects to what Solvejg was saying, and it's like, yeah, I get a lot of questions about like, oh, now your research is showing that plants are so smart and they're doing all these things and they're communicating. How can you eat them? And I'm like, but even better. I eat them with even greater enjoyment because I'm putting my awareness and my gratitude to what the process of eating is, instead of just being unconscious about it and just swallow it down. And in a way, this connects and I'm really grateful for this panel because it actually allows me to deepen my understanding that started to come through when I had to, you know, write my own essay on the wheat, because my major issue that arose was like, wow, I was given, not by choice, this plant as part of my diet. And this plant has made my body for, several years of my life. So I am this plant. And the moment I remove this being and this mind, this other, from this being that I call me, suddenly I changed. So it opens up much deeper question of like, so who am I? Who am I when I say I'm Monica? I'm actually literally what I'm eating. And so I might as well be very grateful and be very aware of what I'm eating. And that means as well how my food arrives to my table or to my pot. It also means how I engage with the politics and the cultural things that humans have constructed to justify certain acts which are violent, that is gratuitous. And that is not the acceptable violence. Violence that is part of the living and dying, I think, has been with us all the time. And we have almost these romantic ideas that, for example, our indigenous people never did anything violent. It's not true. They also ate animals and plants. So how did they survive without that aspect? And yet is how they approach dying, how they approach this violence that is very different. And I think that that is really the most important key to the conversation, rather than, oh, should we try to be less consumerist or more materialist or less capitalist or more of this? Is like these isms are just a little maze where we get lost. At least I get very easily lost. And yet it's very simple. It's very simple. You build relationship with everything that makes you. Otherwise, you're not respecting your relationship. And if you were at home and your mother and father were telling you like, I don't appreciate you doing this, or don't speak to me like that, or they won't allow you to speak and express yourself, well, those are bad relationships. And so those relationships need to be adjusted so that everyone has a voice, everyone has a space, and everyone is honored and respected. And I think that that is really, for me, that is the core of our current dilemma. And that's the end of my rant, sorry.
Thanks, Monica.
I could just jump in. I think everything you've just said, Monica, and previous respondents speaks to relationality at the core of a lot of what we're all talking about. Plants and humans and animals and ecosystems, the relationality of the eating self and the plant eaten. And in particular, Monica, I think what you're saying is inviting certainly me to think about what counts as a good death and a good life, right? Contexts make the meaning of what counts as a just death or just dying so radically different from sort of, biodiverse ecosystemic relations of living and dying to the sort of monocrop industrial landscapes that I've been working in, where it's totalizing, homogenizing, singularizing, flattening death to the benefit of faraway consumer communities. So yeah, that bigger question of what can there be a good death, what counts as a good death, and who gets to decide or draw the line, I think is a really important political and ethical question. And one of the comments from one of the indigenous Marin whom I work with in West Papua is he would often mention that there are monuments for, human dead people in wars and so forth. There's memorialization, and he asked, why are there no monuments for the animals slaughtered in factory farms? There are no monuments for the plants that also, give themselves up to feed us. What would it mean to have rituals of remembrance and physical monuments that memorialize and reckon with those sacrifices? And I just thought it could really change the landscape as well. To have physical ways of commemorating and remembering what must die for us to live in more or less relations of more or less violent care, I suppose.
Great, thanks everyone. For any other comments on the dynamic between kinship and violence in the plant world?
Yeah. Hello?
Yes, Sally, please.
Yeah. It's so fascinating, this conversation, and it just reminds me of something that Joseph Jumet said this morning in one of this morning sessions about when he was talking about coffee. And I wrote it down because it's something, it struck me as something I'd been thinking about as well. He said plants have their own modes to move people to move them. I think that's what he said. Forgive me, Joseph, if I've misquoted you. But it, you know, in context of what we're talking about right now, and actually eating plants, and like Monica was saying about, you know, they become us and we become them, that relationship, and just down to the very basic idea of that, what if they actually love getting to move around in our bodies, you know, like something I've been thinking about. And for them, that, yeah, we don't know, you know, that's it's how it works, isn't it, that we rely on eating them. Even if we eat meat, that meat only exists because of plants. So yeah, it got me thinking about that, and I really love that idea. So yeah.
Yeah, the human-plant relationship is special, isn't it? Having to do with more directly with symbiosis because of the constant exchange that we're involved with plants, exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide and many other things.
There was another question, I don't know if there is time, but there is another question as well that is quite juicy, and I think actually this would be kind of speaking directly to Damiano. Do we have time?
Yes, absolutely.
Shall I read it?
Please, yes, please.
Okay, so the question, it's a little long, but you know, we talked about relationships to the land and its plants in regards to decolonization, settler colonial context in earlier panels. And I was wondering then already about ecofascism appropriations of soil, forest, roots, native invasive species, etc. This panel, and I think Damiano in particular, this is my addiction, seems to be the place to address instrumentalization and essentialization of plants if the panelists will be willing.
So given that I've been called into this conversation, so yes, I think that just following up what has been said the connection. My work is focusing more and more on the connection between epistemology and politics, right? So how we know what we know and how we construct knowledge through also political practices that involve not really, I'm not a big fan of the biologization of politics or biopolitics, but I'm rather trying to follow a more ecosemiotics approach. So how that these kind of exchanges happen through communication, and communication as life rather than the biology of it. And there is an example for me that is crucial in this conversation about ecofascism in Italy, but not exclusively, is that when the forest that I've been working on burned down or partially burned down, the neo-fascists, without talking to the local communities, the people who actually lived in that area, the people who planted those trees, they went up the mountains and they decided to do a political stunt and plant 1,000 more saplings of a different kind of species of fir tree, of pine. And they didn't know what they were doing. And so they planted not in the places, in those terraces, in those construction of care that the original people created for these little trees, but randomly, wherever they thought there was the right place to put it. And so soon, as soon as we have a giant storm, these new trees will be washed away. And that shows you how, you know, ecofascism often is just another form of anthropocentrism, is just the same perspective, the same epistemology, the same ontology even of human-centered understanding of the world. And so it doesn't construct any kind of new knowledge, it's just another form to essentialize our own control over the non-human world. And that's the example that I got from interacting with the forest in itself. I don't know if that answered, but somehow is my perspective on this.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Damiano. Any other questions from the feed?
Solvejg wanted to add something.
Yes, I definitely want to stress that, and I strongly connected to your talk, I mean to all talks, but to yours, Damiano, as well, because I mean I said Germany and Dresden and oak, that is a politically very fraught relationship, and that this oak, the splintered oak, shows the still gaping wound that this bombing is so significant, and it resists. And I really credit the tree with resisting to heal visibly. So neo-fascist and far-right activists are replanting the real, and I'm using as many quotation marks as I can find here, the real German oak forests. And they really go back to say that this whole, that's why I always shudder when I hear native plants, because in Germany that's a very, very fraught thing, because people want to bring back oaks, which I usually want to ascribe to, but they do that to build German forests and to replant nationality. So we really need to go back and ask questions about why that happens. And I love your story, Damiano, because that happens here too. People forget plots of lands, and then suddenly trees spring up that are protected and you can't build on them anymore. And I think telling the stories of the trees that resist that, and the plants that defy this idea of nationality, and they say, well, I'm not native, sue me, get me out of here, try it. And, you know, and how that happens. I really love that. And Angela Merkel can say what she wants while she welcomes refugees. All the plants are already here. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And while I see that we need to sort out the plants that are invasive and get away with everything, I really want to speak up for non-native plants, you know, being feral.
Great, thank you, Solvejg. Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. If there's anything burning in the question feed, Monica.
Yeah, there is one. I don't think this is a small question, but I'll just read it and then yeah. So the question, or kind of question, is perspectives. The Mia, I think Mia Aker is asking whether perspective, to discuss on perspective on non-indigenous people making profit of culturally important trees like the banya trees here on the Sunshine Coast, and then harvesting from tree directly and then selling those nuts, for example. How does that fit in the picture? I guess that's what she's asking. And I read the question, so someone else will have to answer. Or not.
I'd like to answer it, but my answer may not be appreciated. I think we have to rethink possessiveness, and even Indigenous possessiveness. And there has to be a new way forward. And, you know, in principle, selling nuts that Indigenous people also sell is not a crime, but doing it inappropriately or excessively or without guidance or whatever is. So I think the sort of, we have to see that we're all going forward together. And I think that's, I'm sure that the person who I've just said that to won't like the answer. But the bunya trees don't know that you're Indigenous when you're cutting them.
I might add a little comment there as well. I think, I mean, Chelinay, you are Indigenous, so you can say that. And probably for me to say this is even more, I guess, inappropriate. But like the weeds, I think that we also need to stop being so politically correct all the time, to a point where it becomes a ridiculous exaggeration and it becomes yet just another extreme that doesn't serve the purpose. And what I feel that is really needed, and I'm learning this from some of the trees on the landscape that I'm working and also from some of the actual human elders that I've been interacting with, that really we're looking for solutions. That's the goal. We are all humans and we are all looking for solutions, and the solution is in working together. And we're all in the same mess, whether you are Indigenous or not, whether you're Black or white or whatever configuration you want to classify yourself. We are all in the same mess. And this doesn't disregard what is being done, what was done in the past, but is acknowledging that, and some of the beautiful elders that I've heard saying this have really touched me, because for them, especially here in Australia, for them to say like, we need to move on. We need to stop dwelling in the past, because dwelling in the past and, oh, I'm so sorry about what happened, is also another extreme of the same story. And as Damiano was saying, like, it doesn't resolve anything when you just move from one shape of the same epistemology to another one. The same epistemology is being used, so it doesn't do anything new. So I guess it's like, if we are gonna consider ourselves as humanity, then humanity comes in many colors and in many forms. And we have so many different aspects of bodies of knowledge. And if we put them together, then we might actually have a chance to find beautiful solutions that include everyone. And so the selling of something that you feel is not yours is like, well, again, it's a matter of good manners. If you think that these banya pine nuts belongs to someone, well, you ask instead of just taking. But that's a matter of good manners, no matter who you're asking to or who is the taker. And ultimately, and I've been working with many plants, lots of the plants as well are not, they're big spirits, they're big plants. And many times I've been told, and this is how I operate in my own personal life, is that many times I've been told that, especially when it's a matter of learning from them, that learning is not for sale. Their participation and the relationship is not for sale. It's not a sale exchange, it's a relationship. And so if we, again, start to rethink our relating, and that maybe returns to the question of kinship, is like, you wouldn't sell your brother or your mother. Well, in some places people might do, but that's actually not very cool. So in general, it's like, if you consider these are brothers and sisters, these are your elders actually, or plants, of all the beings, plants definitely are elders. So if we can see them as relationship with elderships, then we wouldn't sell your grandma, would you? So why would you sell, at least without acknowledging or asking her, can I sell you? So I think it's, again, a question of good manners and changing our way of interacting with the others that are in our lives.
Thank you, Monica. I think that's a great point to end on. What a fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank all of the speakers who have contributed today. It's just so interesting and generative. But we do have one more contribution, which is a recorded bardic conjuring by Russell Hibbs, who is offering his creative work. So that will pop up in a moment.
3, 2, 1, and rolling. Hello there, everyone. I'd like to introduce you to my He's a cross-pollinator, and he's an ambassador to deep nature. To be or not to be, that's the solar quest I'm on. But it's wonderful to be alive, to be a bee in this beehive. Why? It's a buzz. Ask the wilder bee what the druid said. For nothing is as it seems to be, said he, and I will help you unlock your cellular memory to celebrate the wonder of being in harmony, community. Listen, can you hear a hum in Livingstone? Dr. Livingstone, I presume, or in the ancient trees, or deep within the cells of your own bodies. See my dance, entrance, dance, my measured dance. It's sacred, solar geometry. Come with me and behold the labyrinth. I can lead you through. So let's make a beeline for fields of flowers and pastures of plenty, where the rivers run golden in the land of soya milk and honey. O solar deity, O solar deity, solidarity, remember me. I'm your humble, tumbling, fumbling brother bumblebee, a mere drone, alone, without thee. O beloved, Swami Shri 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 Habibi Sufi Bhakti Bhi, that's me. Full of foible and fallibility, but with high fidelity hum. O great Spirit, that begot and begat and spat me out, bestow upon me your forget-me-nots. And let me pay homage to the honeysuckle and borage. And if me dance is well a wee bit wobbly, it's probably 'cause I trip over me own 6 legs, due to the high pollen count, a drop of the amber nectar, or a jolly old royal jelly bellyache. You understand. And though I may sting myself in my own tail from time to time and need a bit of a prod, it's only because I'm divinely intoxicated. Oh, God. I sup from the cup and swill from the grail of the holy golden flowers, to taste again and again your life-giving powers. For I have slept, cloaked in purple, at the royal court of Mountain Heather, tiptoed and tap-danced on the fragile rims of pale primroses and petunias, been tickled by stamens, no stigma attached, revelled with 10,000 brothers in a nest of mud and wax, till Spirit calls me home to the great honeycomb in the sky, in the sweet, sweet, very sweet by and by. No, I don't need no university degree, man, to be wise. I know where the honey lies. No flies on I and I. I stamp my feet and beat my humming drum to the sun, to the frequency of every flower, far, near, or right here. Heart beats, wings vibrate, and oh, it feels so damn good to pollinate. And so from me, the bee, to you, humanity, I bring you gifts, mead, brimming bright, just a wee dram for second sight, wax for your candles in the dark of the night, and sweet, rich, healing honey. And hey, on these heady halcyon days of foxgloves and dragon schnapps, spare a thought for me, you busy little brother bee. Hear me hum, see me swarm, and let me lull you to calm, to take time out of time, and simply be, simply be, simply be.